I'm really happy today to be joined by Desmond Meade. Why don't you go ahead and give a little introduction about who you are and about your organization?
Yes, no problem. So my name is Desmond Meade. I am the Executive Director of Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, or FRRC. We're an organization in Florida that is centered around people with felony convictions and family members who've had loved ones that's been impacted by our criminal justice system. We over the last few years, we've been primarily focused on felon disenfranchisement, as well as reducing levels of incarceration and specifically around the areas of reentry.
Okay. And then tell me a little bit about how you came to be involved with felony disenfranchisement, not just having a lived experience, but having, but moving a campaign around it.
Yeah, so no, how I came to be involved in felony disenfranchisement is a long story, but there's two parts to it. Part number one was my introduction to Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, right on the heels of a journey that I started back in 2005 when I was standing in front of railroad tracks waiting on the train to come so I could jump in front of it. I was homeless, addicted to drugs, recently released from prison. I didn't have any hope. And I wanted to end my life, but the train didn't come that day. And I checked myself into treatment. After completing drug treatment, I moved into a homeless shelter. While there, I decided to go to school. And I enrolled in a local community college. And at that time that I did, I ended up being introduced to a very loose coalition of organizations and individuals that was focused on changing or getting rid of the felon disenfranchisement policies in Florida. And I became a part of that coalition and eventually turned it into a full-fledged organization in which I lead today.
What do you think was the real heart of that campaign? I mean, it had, by the time we got to the polls, it had overwhelming support. I mean, 2/3 of the voters voted in favor of it. It was bipartisan. Why do you think it was a moment for that bill, for that amendment, or do you think it was something else?
I'm thinking about some stories I've read about previous conversations about the civil rights movement, when a lot of the leaders were asked if they took any conducted any polls or surveys to figure out, when to actually engage in that movement. And, the answer was, the time is right, always right to do what's right. And I think that, what really sat at the heart of our campaign was the fact that it was led by someone who was directly impacted. So the people closest to the pain have always been closest to the solution. And, rather than us just being the figurehead, of a movement or a campaign, we were actually engaged in the strategy and the planning of that campaign. That's, I think, first and foremost, is probably what sits at the heart of it. And I think not too far behind that is the fact that it was a grassroots effort. That, when all of the major organizations and or funders or whatever didn't think that we had a chance and put their attention on something else other than felony disenfranchisement, we were left to ourselves. And the folks that rallied around us, the everyday people, literally from all walks of life and all political persuasions, from the Pensacola all the way to Key West and all points in between, people stood up and they stood with us. And because of that, we were able to form a very strong grassroots bond and foundation that actually served as the driving force behind our campaign.
Right. And tell me a little bit about some of the stories that you heard, because like you said, part of what made it so effective is that it amplified voices of people who were closest to the problem. So are there any stories that stuck out to you?
Oh man, there's quite a few stories that have stuck out to me that really just talking about this movement. You know, I think about this guy named Howie. He was a war veteran. Came back home many years ago. Wrote a bad check, and because he wrote a bad check, he couldn't vote for over 30 years. You have, you know, folks like Sam, who he caught a charge at 18. You know, actually he was at 17, so he lost the right to vote before he was even old enough to vote. You know, and he never was able to get his rights restored 20 something years later. You know, and finally in November of 2018, he was finally able to register to vote. But then you have stories of folks that even speak to a lot of the collateral consequences. You know, one of our leaders, Jessica, you know, talked about how she couldn't even accompany her son on a school field trip. You know, we had firefighters that got in a bar fight and ended up getting convicted of a felony offense and couldn't, you know, be an active member of the PTA like he wanted to because of that stigma that was attached to having a felony conviction. You know, and so there's like one story in particular. I remember in 2016, I was engaged in GOTV efforts to get people to go and vote, and I went to Tampa at an early voting location, and our job was to scour the neighborhood surrounding the voting location, and we had a list of people who were registered voters, and we were knocking on doors and telling folks, listen, you haven't voted yet, there's an opportunity for you to vote, you know, and they're having a fish fry and they have music playing once you come out and vote. Mm-hmm. And I remember running into this guy named Charles, and you know, he was an elderly guy, could barely walk, and I told him that, you know, he could vote. He told me he couldn't, but when I looked on the list, I seen his name, and he showed me a piece of paper that he received in the mail some time back from the supervisor of elections. And what the letter actually told him was actually congratulating him on being registered to vote. He thought that the letter was telling him that he couldn't vote. But we had that letter, we took it with us. We went down to the supervisor of elections office. I'm not the supervisor of elections office, but to the voting location. And I walked with him. You know, he got in his car and I walked alongside his car till we got there. And we got him at the front of the line because he could barely stand. But after a while of being in voting location, he came out shaking his head, and he told me they wouldn't let him vote. And I was perplexed. And when I sat him down and I pulled out my laptop, and when I researched his record, what I found was 8 years prior, he was convicted of driving with a suspended license. And because of that conviction, you know, he wasn't able to vote. And the sad thing about it was that that voting location was right across the street from a graveyard. You know, and I knew I met so many people throughout, you know, my journey who used to say, man, I don't want to die before I get a chance to feel what it's like to be a full American citizen again. I don't want to die before I get a chance to vote. And when I thought about that graveyard and I looked at Mr. Charles, who reminded me of my dad, you know, tears just started flowing down my cheeks because I knew that this man was going to die before he'd get to vote again if we didn't pass Amendment 4.
And tell me a little about your personal journey through this, not necessarily linked to the campaign, but how it felt for you to sort of go through the motions that, you know, millions of people go through, and then to watch Amendment 4 pass. Tell me a little bit about that kind of personal journey.
I'm going to tell you, you know, in 2016, my wife ran for office, and I remember someone approached me and said, "Man, Desmond, I know you can't wait to be able to vote for your wife." And it was like they just stuck a knife in my heart and just twisted it, because it reminded me that I couldn't even vote, you
Mhm.
know. And it was really heart wrenching, because and I was extremely angry, because a couple of days prior, I'm reading stories about how prisoners in Puerto Rico was able to vote in the presidential preference primaries. You know, and I know that people in Maine and Vermont, you know, they can vote while they're in prison as well, you know, knowing that all across the state, in at least 46 other states, that people with felony convictions had the ability to go vote. But because I lived in the state of Florida, um, I couldn't even vote for my own wife. And so when that day came, just as we're approaching, you know, November 2018, we're getting closer and closer to election day, you know, and I'm looking at the polling numbers, right? And we're polling good. You know, I had all my fingers crossed, all my toes crossed, even had my eyes crossed, because it was just seeming so surreal that I was like, man, I'm probably gonna drop dead before this happened, because this seems too good to be true. But lo and behold, on November, that night in November, we did pass it. Over 5.1 million people voted, and there was a ton of relief that I felt. And that same guy, Mr. Charles, who I told you about, was actually at our watch party. And I remember we were hugging each other, crying, and all he could say was, "I can vote now. I can vote now."
That's really beautiful. Um, Tell me, so have you registered?
Yes, I've registered to vote.
And how did that feel? Did it have like, I don't know, some people, people I know probably couldn't remember like the details of when I registered, but
You know, I think that when you lose something and have to fight hard to get it back, you kind of treasure it a little bit more. You know, on the way, I remember on the way to going to register to vote that morning, my family came with me, and actually my daughter, who is my second youngest, she's a part of an organization called Black Youth Vote, which is actually a program within the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation. And you know, so these young folks, they get engaged in voter registration and GOTV and all kinds of civic engagement stuff. And she was part of that organization, and so I had her register me to vote that day while we were inside of the supervisor of elections office. Also on that day, my third oldest son was 17 years old, and so he was able to pre-register, and so he pre-registered with me as well. And so I say that because, you know, back in the civil rights era, you know, when Dad went to go vote, you know, he took his whole family with him. That civic engagement or civic participation was a part of the discussion at the family table, right? And voting was an event. It was something that was supposed to be honored. Well, on my way to register to vote, I was reminded of that era and realized that, you know, after that day, there will be the first time that I'll be able to lead my family to the voting booth, and that's a great feeling. I mean, that's an amazing feeling to know, as you know, the head of my household, that I can really set an example through action for my kids and hopefully my grandkids about how important voting is.
yeah. And I wanted to ask you about, that idea that you sort of cherish what you have to fight for. And I don't know if you saw the New York Times article that was saying, do Floridians really want ex-felons to vote? And it was all about how, there's a disillusionment, right? So everyone like everyone's sort of disillusioned. There's a kind of broad thing about getting young people to vote and get out the vote and denying this disillusionment, but especially people who are still in that phase where maybe, they're still in that hopelessness. They have been told over and over and over again that their voice doesn't matter. They've been told over and over again that, like, all you ever be to us is a criminal.
Yeah.
Do you see that still playing out now that Amendment 4 has passed, or do you see a larger, tell me what it looks like now?
No, so I think it's a shift. I think, when you talk about being disillusioned around voting, I think that's across the board. So it's not specific to a specific group of people, right? You find that, just when you look at the United States as a whole, that there's a significant amount of people who are registered voters that don't vote. I know in Florida at a time that there was over like 2.4 million people of color, just 2.4 million people of color alone that were registered voters that did not vote. And so there's a lot to unpack there. But what I can say is this, is that after Amendment 4 passed, the people that understood what Amendment 4 did created a renewed spirit, or Amendment 4 passing, I should say, created a renewed spirit in a lot of returning citizens. I remember there were returning citizens calling our office that was so excited. One of them said the last time they voted for John F. Kennedy, right? Or the last time they voted for Jimmy Carter, right? We have folks who lost the right to vote before they were old enough to vote, and then now that they were being able to register to vote, they registered with their son, who just turned 18. And so father and son registering to vote together. And that meant something to those folks. Then you had people on Facebook that was like, I don't care if it's a dog catcher race going on, I'm going to go vote, right? There is a hidden yearning that stays suppressed and sometimes dormant within people with felony conviction, that's been there for a while, and it is that feeling of, okay, I'm not a part of, right? I'm not a part of society. When I got out of prison and somebody asked me if I could register to vote or will I register to vote, it's like a slap in my face reminding me that I'm not a part of, right? And that is painful to constantly be reminded that you're not good enough, or you're not a part of it, you're not a citizen. And what I've seen is that a lot of people suppress it, and they suppress it with a false sense of bravado. They may suppress that with an indifference to voting, right? Like, so many people that we approach and we ask them about going to vote, and they're like, man, I don't care about that, man. It don't matter. My vote don't count. It don't matter who gets in office, right? All of the lines that we're so used to hearing. But then for a lot of those folks, like from what I've personally experienced, is when I dug deeper, come to find out that those people couldn't even vote anyhow, right? They couldn't vote anyhow. And so that indifference was to mask the pain of not being a part of. And so when folks are made aware that now they can vote, there's a transformation there. I've seen it even before we passed Amendment 4. And there were cases where people had a felony conviction, but the adjudication was withheld. And because the adjudication was withheld, they never really lost their civil rights. But in their head, they're thinking, well, I have a felony conviction, I can't vote. I knew a gentleman, he was in a union guy, for like 8 years, he didn't vote. He didn't register to vote because he was like, I'm a convicted felon, I can't vote. And when I looked up his case and seen that he had a withhold adjudication, and I was able to show him that he never lost the right to vote, he just broke down and started crying. And he was like, you mean to tell me I could have voted for President Obama? And it was like, yeah. And so I've seen it even before Amendment 4, that people would just, especially folks with felony convictions, would just internalize it and create this wall of indifference, or even or create an attitude right, that is so anti civic engagement that you're wondering, wow, what's this guy problem? But what I've discovered is it's just been a reaction to being shunned in society, and that's a coping mechanism. And so I know that these folks and other folks, once they were aware that Amendment 4 passed, the response have been like really, really exciting. People have been able to come out the shadows. Their voices can be heard now.
Yeah.
You know, and especially when they realize that collectively people with felony convictions have the power to transform their community, have the power to shift an electorate, you know, and have the power to actually change policies that they know are detrimental.
Yeah. I mean, Amendment 4 is a great example of what that looks like. We have 1 minute left. I do want to ask quickly about where the fight is now. So I think there was a hearing today, actually. I know that it's being challenged over and over again. So, but it looks like so far so good. Can you tell me a little bit how the law might finally be on the right side this time?
I do not count my chickens before they're hatched.
Okay.
I don't do that. Another thing that we do at FRC is that we let the litigators litigate, we let the legislators legislate, right? And what we have to do, or what we're committed to doing, because see what happens, and we were able to show that even in Amendment 4. As long as politicians are involved, very little would get done, right? And every time there's partisan bickering and back and forth, the only casualties are the people, right? And so politicians had more than enough time to get this thing right, and they didn't have the courage to do so, the willpower to do so. And so we took it upon ourselves to do it ourselves, and we didn't have any politician have played any role in our campaign. We kept our campaign above partisan politics. We wouldn't even allow our campaign to be called a bipartisan campaign or even a nonpartisan campaign. The way to properly identify us was that we were a grassroots movement that welcomed and enjoyed bipartisan support. And the difference is we led with the people, not with the politics, right? And so we know that even in the turmoil that we're in today, as far as with the litigation, that and the turmoil that we had to endure last year during the phase when they were trying to draft implementation legislation for Amendment 4. What ended up getting lost in all of those discussions are regular everyday people. People like you and me, people that just want to live in a community that's safe, people that just want to be able to pursue life, happiness, and liberty. You know, people who, we made a mistake, but we paid our debt and we want to move on with our lives. And those are the people and their family members that get lost when this bickering go back and forth. I give you a perfect example of this. Look at this COVID-19 pandemic, right? That anytime we have there's a problem with how we're able to respond to that, it's always connected to politicians. But when we, the people, just get rid of the politicians and come together, that's when we see the beautiful stories of COVID-19, right? All of the horror stories are directly tied to politicians, you know? And so at the end of the day, we know that our power rests in real people, everyday people. We know that's where the pain is at, and that's where the investment is in the suffering. And so that's what we focus on. So whether it's the legislation that we have to operate on under right now, or hopefully, you know, we get a very favorable outcome from the courts. Either way it goes, our vision and our mindset is dead set on people, and we're going to work within any system to make sure that anybody that want to vote have the ability to vote if they so choose.
Great. Any advice for ACA 6? We're fighting over here to get 50,000 people on parole. Their voting rights restored. Any advice?
Keep directly impacted people at the center. their voices matter the most, right? And here's the thing, right? Win, lose, or draw, they stand the most to lose. And when you have those type of people at the center of your campaign, you can never fail. You could overcome any obstacles. You know, Amendment 4 never should have happened. All of the experts said it would never happen in a million years. Never, ever. And we did it. Not only did we do it, we did it in grand fashion. We had over 1 million more votes than any other candidate on the ballot received, right? We was able to short circuit any potential opposition. And so here we are with a controversial issue, dealing with controversial people in a controversial state during a controversial political climate. And we came out of this smelling like roses without any major opposition. And that was accomplished by keeping people at the center. That was accomplished by letting the grassroots actually drive the campaign. That and at the end of the day, I think what was that energy that propelled us through was actually a spirit of love, really unadulterated love. You know, one that that they even talk about in the Bible. You know, and one of the ways I explain it is, wanting for your neighbor what you want for yourself. You know, and understanding that you're not fighting for the others. You're fighting for us. You know what I'm saying? That we are, in spite of our racial differences, differences in ethnicity, in spite of our political differences, that we are a human race, one human race. And there is so much that connects us, much more that connects us than what divides us. And if we can come together along the lines of humanity, and that's what you do, you appeal to the humanity piece in people, and you lead with love, and you make sure that the people that's leading it are people that's experiencing the pain. I think that's all of the right ingredients for success.
That's great. I mean, you almost sound like a politician.
You know what? I might sound like a public servant. And I think that nowadays there's a difference. There's a stark difference between a politician and a public servant now.
Agreed.